Hi everyone, my name is Morgan and I am a mental health speaker with Minding Your Mind. I travel all around the country to different schools and organizations to tell my mental health story in hopes that if anyone listening is struggling, hopefully they'll feel less alone. And then also, I really want people to reach out for help if they're also struggling. Today, I'm going to tell you a story about a time that I was really struggling and what I did to get through that hard time. Today, I want to tell the story about the time that I was hospitalized for my mental health. Before being hospitalized, my problems around my mental health was building for a really long time. I grew up struggling with a lot of anxiety when I was younger. I'm someone that naturally has really big feelings to this day. But when I was little and I experienced these big feelings, I thought that something was wrong with me for having these big feelings. So I hid them from the people around me. And I never talked about the big feelings or the worries that I was constantly experiencing. As I got older, a lot of these big feelings that I wasn't dealing with started to intensify and became a lot more complicated. When I was a teenager, I started to enter romantic relationships. And when those romantic relationships ended, I was left with big feelings that weren't as easy to ignore as they were in the past. In order for me to manage these big feelings, I reached towards coping mechanisms that weren't very helpful. So at the time, I started to try to find control through things like my eating and exercise, and I eventually developed an eating disorder. This eating disorder became a central part of my life, dictating how I thought, ate, and lived. A lot of the behaviors that I engaged in with my eating disorder on the surface looked like discipline, but underneath it all, they were a way to cope with feelings that I didn't know how to express. I eventually became really depressed, and I lost hope that anyone would actually accept me for who I really am and the big feelings that I really experience. I had a lot more anxiety, more than I even had when I was younger, and I constantly struggled with these thoughts about worries and thinking the worst case scenario, and my chest would get really tight, and my body would start sweating, and I had all these awful thoughts, and it was the worst feeling ever. But eventually, when I was 16 years old, I was hospitalized for my mental health. And this was such a hard experience for me because up until this point, I didn't talk about what I was going through. So this experience was the first time that I had to face what I was going through head on, and that was so intimidating and scary for me. When I first got to this treatment center, one of the first things that had to happen was I had to go to therapy groups. And in these groups, we were encouraged to talk about what was really going on with us. But like I mentioned earlier, I suppressed a lot of my emotions and hid my big feelings from the people around me. And I felt a lot of shame for having these big feelings. But in these groups, I decided that I was going to slowly talk about some of the things that were really going on with me. And when I did, I noticed something so important. And that's that the more I allowed myself to be vulnerable and actually open up about what was happening with me, the more other people at the center also felt safe to be vulnerable and open up with what was going on with them too. Eventually, I started to connect with others through some of the experiences that we had. And although none of us went through all of the same things, we could all connect on some of the same emotions and feeling those difficult emotions. Group therapy was so helpful for me to feel less shame and less alone in what I was going through. Individual therapy was also helpful when I was at this treatment center because that helped me understand why I was coping in the ways that I was, and then also develop healthier ways for me to manage my big feelings and the mental health struggles that I was going through at the time. If there's anything that I could go back and tell my younger self at this time, is that there were so many people that truly wanted to help me get better. I just had to give them the chance to help me. Even reaching out just to say I'm not okay could have started to relieve some of that weight that I was carrying. And I'm so glad that I eventually did reach out for help. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope it was helpful, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.